Congressman Jamaal Bowman is an educator, legislator, and community leader who has committed his career to dismantling systemic inequities and uplifting marginalized communities. As a U.S. Congressman for New York's 16th District, he introduced groundbreaking legislation such as the Green New Deal for public schools, the African American History Act, and the Broadband Justice Act, and secured nearly $50 million in federal funding for education, healthcare, workforce development, and infrastructure. His leadership advanced initiatives in youth violence prevention, behavioral health expansion, and sustainable housing while advocating for equality in education and public policy. Prior to Congress, Congressman Bowman served as the founding principal of the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action Middle School in the Bronx, where he built a nationally recognized model for culturally responsive education. His scholarship, including his doctoral dissertation on community schools, reflects his lifelong commitment to holistic, community-driven solutions. Bowman's work embodies a bold vision for justice, combining activism, scholarship, and leadership to create transformative change in classrooms, communities, and beyond.
Awesome. And thanks again for doing this. Much appreciated, especially given your unique kind of background as being in the belly of both beasts. But it's a real pleasure to have you here, Representative Bowman. And I wanted to get started by sharing a bit more about your backgrounds with our listeners. And it'd be great to hear what motivated you to run for Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I had been in education for 20 years. The last 10 years, I was a middle school principal, founding principal of the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action Middle School, wrote the proposal, opened it, led it as a principal for 10 years. Prior to that, I was a high school guidance counselor, dean of students, teacher, kind of wore multiple hats. And then I started my career in 99 as an elementary school teacher. So I had 20 years experience in public education, and in that space, I just learned a whole lot. I learned a lot more about community and kids from different communities who mirrored the community I was born and raised in, but also the impact of policy on education, the impact of policy on the lives of my students and families, and the impact of funding on public education as well, right? When you look at the funding disparities between, kids who live in the Bronx and kids who live in wealthier communities, that combined with policies that were just hundreds of years old, just got me to the point of frustration. I wanted to do more for the kids that I was serving all that time. And I felt like I was kind of hitting my head against the wall in education. Like it was like this freeze on real innovation and growth and new ideas. So I had finished my doctorate, I think early 2019, like January, February 2019. I was looking for the next thing to do. And there was some exciting stuff happening in politics, with, the squad being elected in 2018 and Bernie Sanders movement in 2016, Black Lives Matter growth across the country, piggybacking on Occupy Wall Street. So I felt like there was this real movement, culture, and energy around elected office. And then the last kind of final straw, I started to try to work with elected officials, every level of government, to do more for education. And I realized that they didn't know education very well. And not only did they not know education well, they didn't seem to have the interest in learning much about what was happening with our kids and families. And they didn't bring a sense of urgency to it. And so all of that combined led me to make the crazy decision to run for my first office ever. And it was a congressional office against a 31-year incumbent who, I knew he wasn't really doing much. And I knew that I had built a pretty strong reputation in my district because of course, you have to live in the district, but my school was in the district where I was principal for 10 years. So I knew at the very least, about 90% of those families would have some good things to say about me, and then hopefully they would organically spread the word. And so that's why I ran, and I think that's what helped us to win.
That's incredible. And so grateful that you took that step. And you must have learned an enormous amount, both as a principal and an administrator, and then through your experience at Congress. I'm curious, what were the learnings from your leadership of schools that translated and maybe helped you make the transition? And what were the brand new things you had to figure out? What was that transition like?
Yeah, I mean, so the importance of just being, because you know, there are building principles and then there are community principles, right? And so a building principle pretty much opens the school, does school every day, the normal schedule of school. You know, you got breakfast, you got your classes, you got lunch, you got some tutoring, you got some after school programs. If that, they close up the school and then they go home and that's kind of their job, right? But for me, I always saw myself and tried to conduct myself as like a community principal. So I always tried to work in collaboration with community-based organizations that were doing great work in the district. So there was one program, Sports and Arts, that we brought in to run after-school programs for our kids. And it wasn't just sports and arts, and it was also tutoring. And so those kind of partnerships, we had a partnership with a visiting nurse service where they would come in twice a week to provide mental health supports to our kids. We had a series of, community-based partnerships that helped our schools to provide additional programming for kids and families, and helped our kids to do better, academically and socially. And so those deep-rooted relationships in the community, in the district, were very helpful when I got to Congress, because then I could work in collaboration with those organizations to work on policy issues, right? So that was very key. Another key was I could begin to direct federal funding from my office to community-based organizations that I knew were doing good work. I mean, you may know this, the vetting process of trying to figure out which community-based organizations are doing good work and which ones aren't is just it's an arduous task. But I knew through my relationships and I knew through some of the work I've done as a principal which ones were doing good work. And so being rooted in the community as a principal really helped when I got to Congress in that way. We started directing resources to the right places. What was the challenge for me when I got to Congress was the procedural stuff, like how are you supposed to speak when you're in committee, how you're supposed to respond to a comment and then make your own comments, decorum, if you will, Robert's Rules of Order. That was very uncomfortable for me. So it took me about a year or two to even get comfortable, like using that language in that space. Another challenge was I'm used to being, when you're in building principal in New York City, you're in like the executive position. And so to go from like having a budget and making decisions day to day that you were in control of for your kids and families, to now being one of 435 in the House, 535 in all of Congress, and you're a freshman and you don't really have, I was chair of a subcommittee, which was amazing, but you don't really have power to really say, okay, we need to do, like, gun violence is killing our kids, right? Disproportionately. We need to do something about gun violence today, not 2 years from now when Democrats win. Like that became like very hard to deal with for someone like me who's used to being like an executive and making like direct decisions as a practitioner versus a legislator.
Congressman, that makes me think of, the question is the procedure there to help or is it there to hinder? And so I'm just curious as to your perspective as someone who is a community leader and a change maker, because I think one could look at all of those layers and it is perhaps by design, right, to make change slow, to make it cumbersome so that the change that bubbles to the top is right, if you're trying to kind of think about what the ideal of the system could be. But is that the ideal, or are there other ways that we should be thinking about representative government? Are there other ways that we should be thinking about to structure Congress and the system that would make it actually more efficient for the people?
It's a great question. I would think the procedures many of them that exist within Congress are down on the list as I think about democracy reform and what needs to happen with democracy reform. I would argue the biggest problem we have in Congress is big money in politics, and the impact of special interests. Now we have levels of wealth inequality that are so out of control. You can have a single individual with their money really determine what happens in elections, right? Or have a big, can really place their hand on the scale and really weigh things in the favor of their candidate because they're worth $100 billion or $500 billion or whatever, right? So big money in politics and the special interest part of it is probably the biggest problem. So since Citizens United, it's really challenging for working class people from certain communities to run for office, right? And this is why I always give Bernie credit, because his campaign was all about small dollar contributions. And if you're able to build enough momentum and have like national small dollar contributions supporting you, you could run and have a chance. But many of my colleagues, man, like they work the phones, but they're not working the phones like small dollar people have still work the phones, right? Because you take someone like me, I never took corporate PAC money, as a candidate. And so the max you could donate to me was, let's say, $5,000 from individuals, right? But most of my donations, 80 to 85%, came from small dollars. And so many people in Congress, they'll vote or advocate for certain pieces of legislation in alignment with what their donors want them to do versus their constituents. And so through this big money in politics, you have the suppression of the voices we need to hear from the most, the voices of working class people who are too busy working, going to school, and taking care of their families to even pay attention to what's going on in politics. And so I would say big money is a major, major issue that's probably at the top of my list. But when we talk about democracy reform, talking about one of those procedures that I mentioned before, there's something in the Senate called a filibuster, where you need a supermajority to pass a piece of legislation in the Senate. And if it doesn't pass the Senate, it's not going to get to the president's desk to become law. But with the filibuster, members in the Senate, senators can decide not to support a bill and not even have to debate on the floor why they made that decision. And so the Senate doesn't really lead on any legislation unless they go into the drafting of the legislation with a 60-40 support of the legislation. That is crazy. And this is something that can change simply with a vote led by the Senate Majority Leader. Senate Majority Leader say something like that is why we still don't have affordable childcare, universal childcare, or pre-K, or paid leave, or any of the policies that we really need to help vulnerable American people. So that ending the filibuster in the Senate, the way it currently functions, is really key to democracy reform. And just quickly, I also personally support expanding the Supreme Court or putting term limits on the Supreme Court, and definitely ethics reform in the Supreme Court, because you have big money influencing the Supreme Court. I mean, you have somebody paying Clarence Thomas's mother's bills, a billionaire. Like, this is crazy. Like, taking them on trips and yachts and paying for education of Supreme Court members' children and grandchildren. And so there needs reform there. And then I also support, doing something about the Electoral College, because, we're a democracy, it should be one person, one vote. But the way it's designed with the Electoral College and the Senate, we have minority rule. So you have, let's say, 50 Republican senators, 50 Democratic senators. The 50 Republican senators actually represent less people, but they have as much power as the 50 Democratic senators. And so, not to get too in the weeds of all that, but that's All that stuff is why we can't pass common sense legislation like paid leave, even though the majority of developed countries already have paid leave.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the weeds are where we need to be. Congressman, I think, the Senate filibuster is one thing, and I think it's certainly, I think we hear a lot about it as being one of the primary things that kind of cogs the system. But I'm really curious, to hear more about how you translated your experience and your expertise as a principal and a community member and a community leader into the legislation that you wrote as a member of the House. And I'm, really curious as to your perspective of what happens to that policy if it never comes out of committee, because I know that a lot of, I know that some of the legislation that you worked on, such as Green Deal for public schools, some of that stuff never even gets a shot at a floor vote. And I don't know that a lot of people know that, right? That writing it in of itself does not bring it to a vote. So I know that's a loaded question, but I would just love us to take us on that journey a little bit.
I feel privileged to have these conversations because I don't get to have them much. When you go on CNN, you got 6 minutes and they ask you these gotcha questions and you got like 30 seconds to answer and you don't really get into the meat of anything, right? But you're exactly right. That question is exactly right. And I'll speak about my experiences there, but I want to give you an example. So Rosa DeLauro, who's our ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, has been working to make the child tax credit permanent for over a decade, right? And the child tax credit, so that people understand, it provides financial resources to children who live in poverty on a monthly basis to lift children out of poverty. If we were to implement the child tax credit the way that Rosa DeLauro wrote the legislation, 50% of children in America will be out of poverty tomorrow. During COVID, when we implemented the child tax credit for a year, it lifted 50% of children out of poverty. The Republicans argue that when you do that, welfare queens code Black women in the projects are going to buy drugs and alcohol with that money. We studied what people did with the money that they received during COVID. And you know what they did? They paid their freaking bills. And they put food on the table and they got rid of their debt. A year later, Republicans decided to allow it to expire. Child tax credit went away, 50% of children back into poverty. I mention this bill because one would think that, of course, we don't want our children to live in poverty. We're the wealthiest nation on earth. But Rosa's been working to make this bill permanent for over a decade. And she's still working it. And it's become her baby bill that she will work with for her whole career. And that is the design of Congress. It's designed for people to be there for decades. And then if you're lucky, one of your bills that you've worked on for decades will get passed, and then you change America in the process, if you're lucky. And that goes to the intransigence and the dense nature of how the whole place works. Now, let's go to my tenure in Congress, which was short, only 4 years. And this happens with every piece of legislation, but it happened with mine as well. When you write a piece of legislation, first thing it does, it goes to a committee. The committee chair or ranking member can decide, do we want to take this up and mark it up in committee and bring it to a vote in the committee or not? Now, if there's Republican control and Democrats are trying to get their bills looked at, that's less likely to happen, of course, unless they're bipartisan bills, which is kind of a good thing. We want bipartisanship. But sometimes if you have Democrat control and the bills are too quote unquote progressive, they still won't get looked at in committee. But the other part of writing a bill is not just to make it become law. Every bill has the opportunity, especially if done the right way, to set a vision for America as it relates to a particular issue. So our Green New Deal for public schools seeks to bring a revolution to the public school system. by rebuilding the physical infrastructure, by centering STEM and STEAM education, by creating workforce development programs in our most marginalized community, and really preparing kids for a 21st century economy. It seeks to invest $1.43 trillion in public schools over 10 years. And many ask, how would you pay for it? Well, if corporations paid their fair share and people stopped dodging on their taxes and the wealthy contributed their fair share, you could pay for it very easily, and other things. Now, this bill never got marked up in committee. Now that I'm out of Congress, I passed it on to one of my colleagues. Pramila Jayapal is going to be the champion of the bill. But what happens is, and this is the great thing about being in Congress, you have the bully pulpit. So when I introduce a bill like that, states are paying attention, cities are paying attention, counties are paying attention, leaders across the country are paying attention, and they'll say something like, hey, maybe we can do that here. Can we take a piece of that or some of that or try that in our backyard? And then you'll see it happening. Oh man, I feel embarrassed. There is a city or a school district that has adopted many of the parameters, multiple actually, of the Green New Deal for public schools, and they're going to implement it in their school district. And so every bill does two things. One is a messaging bill. This is a vision for where we want to go, like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the 13th Amendment back in the days, right? And different amendments to the Constitution. It was a vision, didn't happen right away, but then you get the right leaders, the right circumstances, the right movements on the outside, and either you do it, someone does it in a different context, or you do it in Congress. And so that's what we did with the African American History Act. Oh, one other thing I want to say. We don't do bills in vacuums. We work with community. So the same way I mentioned in education, we would work in collaboration with organizations to come into the school and do good work. We work with community to write these bills. So yes, I'm an expert in education, I think, and I would argue with my doctorate, but I work with other experts in education to write that bill. It was co-written, or mostly written by two professors from Princeton University who had backgrounds in climate justice and education. And so we write these bills in community, and we work with community-based organizations to endorse the bills so that when we introduce them, we have a list of 10, 20, 50, 100 organizations, and it gives the bill more credibility. And that happens with every piece of legislation, or maybe 99% piece of legislation we've written. The African American History Act, the Mental Health for All Act, and so many others.
Representative Bowman, that's amazing. Thanks for bringing us into some of the inner workings of how these things get made, and also some of the limitations in the system, like the presence of special interests and funding and the procedural barriers. It makes me wonder, how we can change the system, because clearly these barriers are benefiting someone else. Makes me angry because, I wonder how many libraries could be built with this lobbying money. I wonder how many school lunches or how many kids could be lifted out of poverty with the funding that's being spent on bombs. Which brings me to thinking about the role that education can play, and also looking at some specific issues. So you are known for valuing the teaching of Black history to students, and also for your criticism of Israel, in particular with the atrocities that have been committed ongoing today. And both of which are issues that the far right sought to capitalize on. And we've now also seen a parallel in education with reports from institutions from K-12 to colleges punishing students and teachers for speaking out on these issues. What do you make of this, and what can we do about it? What role do you think education has to play here?
Yeah, to quote Nelson Mandela, education is the most powerful tool that can be used to change the world. And it's not just education in our K-12 systems, it's education in our communities as well. It's education in our homes. It's adult education. It's all of it. Our lives should be surrounded by constant learning and growth and connection and community building, especially now. I'm very worried and concerned by everything you just mentioned, the banning of books, the prioritization of war and genocide over children and people, but also the impact of technology on brains that are still developing, underdeveloped, and students and young people who've gone through education systems that don't prioritize critical thinking and reading discerningly and creative problem solving and 21st century skills. And so you and I met, Amir, because we connected via an education network trying to do something different, right? Innovative and aligned to the current country and society in which we live in. And I think that's what we need, man. I mean, everybody has one of these. These can be used as professors in your pocket if we design the right tools for them to be used in that way. And everyone needs that because we are, I didn't live during McCarthyism, but it feels that way. Especially when we talk about the silencing of dissenting voices. Ta-Nehisi Coates, you mentioned Israel. He spoke about his trip to Israel and Palestine and what he experienced. And he said, this feels familiar. This feels like Jim Crow. And he said he's a child of Jim Crow. And him and I are the same age. We're both children of Jim Crow. And so I didn't live during Jim Crow, but I was born from parents who lived during Jim Crow. So that's how it feels as well, right? And, to use a fictional reference, I feel literally like we're living in the Matrix, where everyone's plugged in to something to control how they think and behave. And those that resist are attacked and ridiculed and oppressed for it. I mean, think about New York City. You're talking about the finance engine of the country and one of the finance engines of the world, if not the finance engine of the world. A city with beautiful diversity. And you have resigned in disgrace former Governor Cuomo, resigned in disgrace because of multiple sexual assault allegations, who also was criticized for putting seniors in nursing homes during COVID, ratcheting up the death toll. He's now about to run for mayor, running on a platform as a member of the defense team for Benjamin Netanyahu, who is facing international charges of genocide. He's running on this. So we speak this, right? So the question is, what can education do? Education can do a lot. It can do everything, but it has to be grassroots. It has to be community centered. It has to be on the ground. And so I'm going to be involved in Mayor. I'm going to talk to you about this at some point. I'm going to be involved in a lot of community organizing in this next chapter in my life, where I'm going to be really organizing parents, students, renters, because the majority of the people in this country are renters, and they're most likely people not to vote. But I'm going to be organizing them, not just me, but others, organizing them in a way where we're providing the liberating education that they need for their communities so that we don't stay in this place of, many would call fascism, that we're entering now, for any extended period of time. The only way America reaches its full potential and manifests the value of its ideals on paper is if every American, regardless of background or zip code or race or religion or culture or economic status, has access to the same opportunities as everyone else. And that starts with education.
When you talk about the ideals of America, as an immigrant, that's what attracted me. I studied America. I studied what was written. And now that I'm here, I see the discrepancy between the reality and the ideals. And I don't know what to think. And maybe you can characterize for me, should I be pessimistic or optimistic? On the one hand, you you have this guy who you alluded to before, who might have quite a lot of money, $100 billion and plus, and, going on about free speech while at the same time suppressing it and espousing fascist ideals and influencing politics, and this seeming regression, towards Jim Crow and backlash against the progress that has been made. And on the other hand, and that's reason, in my view, to be worried. But then on the other hand, there seems to be a much wider awareness and awakening and resistance of what is happening. And so I don't know what to make of this. What do you make of this?
It's a paradox, man. What's the, I don't know if you know the James Baldwin quote, Amir. He's talking about being a black man in America, right? He says to be a black man in America and to be relatively conscious is, and I'm paraphrasing here, is to constantly live with suppressed rage, right? And so that's the paradox of America. That's what it is to be here, especially for certain groups, right? Chris Rock, he has a great joke, man, that kind of says the same thing. He says, America is like the uncle that paid your way through college but molested you. It's a very crass joke, but it captures, I think, the conflict that I live with every day, particularly as a black man with black children and a black son who just graduated from college today, right? Which, very proud and a lot of work. And he had a chance to go to an affordable community college before he got to a 4-year college, right? In his state of New Jersey, Democratic led. So happy about all those things. But then on the other hand, you see, a former military veteran choke a homeless person with mental health needs to death on a train in New York City and then get acquitted for it, right? And so I'm biasly an optimistic person, Amir. So I'm going to ask you to be optimistic. When I look at my own life and the fact that, I was raised by a single mom, was on public assistance, dealt with my share of trauma in my home, was the first in my family to go to college, first in my family to get a master's, doctorate, to open my own school, to run for Congress and win, to become a pretty important voice in politics. I mean, to come from where I came from and do that, you got to be optimistic. And so I'm more optimistic than pessimistic, but I have no doubt that the power rests with the people. And once we engage the people, the right people, right, the people who are often ignored, often marginalized, the people with the historical trauma, engage them as assets, not saviors. We are not coming to save them. They know what the hell is going on. They live it every day. We need to work with them as assets to help inform us so that then we can start a movement in this country. I mean, listen, and I'll close with this. This is another thing that's always in conflict. Abolitionists fought to end slavery in this country. Civil rights activists, Black Power activists fought to pass the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. It wasn't members of Congress and it wasn't the president with their goodwill. They were forced to do it. And we have many martyrs to show for it, right? Unfortunately. But it's that kind of fight that makes America what it's supposed to be.
Congressman, I love that you quoted Baldwin, because as Amir asked the question, another Baldwin quote came to mind when he was being asked a similar question around, like, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? And his response was, you can't tell the children there's no hope.
Yeah.
Right? Because
That's right.
What's all this for?
That's exactly right. And Amir, Baldwin is I'm so happy he's getting his just due over the last several years, because I'll tell you very honestly, I was ignorant to Baldwin. Growing up, it was always Malcolm or Martin. Malcolm Martin, and they'll throw, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman in there every now and then. But I Am Not Your Negro, Amir, I don't know if you've ever seen this Baldwin documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. Oh man, it's incredible. And then if you are able to read some of his work, you can just go down the YouTube rabbit hole right now. Baldwin, he is incredible.
Yeah, or watch the debate with Buckley. I don't know if you've ever seen that one.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
He does an Oxford Union debate with Buckley.
Yeah, Oxford. Yeah, you got to watch that. It's in Oxford.
I mean,
it's Oxford, but I'll take the recommendation. Thank you.
It's British. But, Congressman, I'm curious, and you talk about this moment of time that we find ourselves in where technology is ever present, and it can both be the professor in your pocket, but also this, it can also be a great ailment for a lot of students and a lot of kids and a lot of people, regardless of their age. And we also find ourselves in a moment of time where a lot of the platforms and tools that people use to consume media and news are ridding themselves of any obligation to say what is fact or what is fiction. And so there is ever more information that every adult, kid, anyone who uses these platforms is then left to parse through. And you talk about the role of education in terms of teaching critical thinking. And so I'm just curious as to your perspective, more so as an educator and a parent more than anything else. It's what do folks in the classroom do? What do parents do to help their children and also to help each other navigate in this moment of very fractured information? And to the part of you that is an organizer, right? Or, how do people organize in a moment of time when that is the case? And there is moving narratives on what's true and what's false.
Yeah, we need education mutual aid networks. When COVID hit, mutual aid networks just sprouted up all over the country, where people were doing everything they can to make sure they were getting food to seniors, food to the homeless, food to people who were disabled, just taking care of each other through mutual aid networks. We need an education mutual aid network where we are sharing opportunities for dialogue, discussion, collective learning, and critical thinking. And this is living room to living room. This is phone call to phone call. This is via technology. If it doesn't exist, we need to create the technology that is a safe space for true fact and critical thinking. We need to do that like yesterday because people are overwhelmed. I see it. I feel it myself personally at times, but from my peers and friends and colleagues, you don't know what's what. And it's too much information, so it's overwhelming. So there needs to be a digital safe space for adults. There absolutely needs to be digital safe spaces for kids. But for kids and for adults, man, we need to take our asses outside, yo, like straight up. So Kendrick Lamar got this new song called Turn the TV Off. TV Off. It's amazing. But go outside. Like, we need our kids to be dancing, singing, playing instruments, in nature, doing sports, out of the freaking house. Listen, again, everybody choose what they want to choose, but I live in a suburb part of Yonkers, like the city. And I grew up in Manhattan, New York City. I was outside at 7 all day, and I wouldn't come home till it was dark. I want to kick my kids out of the house right now. Like, that's what I want to do. And so we need to literally unplug by having our young people do everything other than being on technology, right? Like, bare minimum, right? Technology. But for the parents and adults, man, we need networks and community together so that we could help navigate this stuff. I don't know where to go for that. And then even before, Mark Zuckerberg said what he recently said and what we already knew was going on, even before that, he used to always say Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, X, YouTube. Like, this can't be the end all be all of like social media, right? Like, that can't be it. Like, this has to be the start of it, but it can't be it, because it is at best there's a lot of education, it's a lot of entertainment, but mostly I would argue it's a lot of, like I tell my daughter, doom scrolling. And so we need to unplug literally with our kids, man. In my school, like, we didn't allow kids to use cell phones during the school day just because there was no need for it. After school programs, same thing, right? But like, and then again, this goes back to like the education system. When standardized testing came in with No Child Left Behind, we legislated recess and gym and music and extracurriculars out of the school, and we hired more English and math teachers so that we can make sure kids could pass the English and math test that they take every year from grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. But like, what if a kid wants to learn the keyboard or play soccer or whatever? And what's even more frustrating, this is where the discrepancies come in, the class discrepancies. In the wealthier districts, kids do all that stuff. Like, it's still there. But in the poor schools in the Bronx and Mount Vernon, it's like a luxury to have this stuff, which is crazy. And so short answer is kids need to plug, go outside, fresh air, nature, sports, music, the art. There's, I don't know, Amir, you might be familiar with these guys. Sir Ken Robinson. Are you familiar with Sir Ken Robinson, Justin? So he used to talk about I think this was at one point the most watched TED Talk ever. Do schools kill creativity? Yes, they do. Of course, they kill creativity. We educate only the brain and mostly the one side, the left side, not the creative side. We don't educate the body. We don't educate the heart, the mind. We don't have emotional intelligence in our schools. You know how important emotional intelligence is to living? Self-awareness, social awareness, empathy, compassion. That's where your superpower is, right? We don't even nurture that. You guys are asking good questions. You got me in rants over here. I'm ranting. I don't want to rant, but I'm really passionate about this, man. And what's even worse is we have the resources to do it. That's what's worse. The financial resources and the human resources, we have both. We're just not allocating it in this direction.
I love the rant. This is the Outspoken podcast. I'll also say Sir Ken Robinson was a big influence on founding Outschool, and that TED Talk you reference is incredible and so.
Oh man, he has a RSA Animate. Do you know RSA Animate? So they would have like a voiceover, and it would be someone drawing with the voiceover. And here's Sir Ken Robinson's Changing Education Paradigms, very powerful. Just a quick short story. I was a second or third year principal, and I hired an amazing teacher from Teach for America. Shout out to Teach for America, but I don't really rock with them, just to be very clear, because I don't like the 2-year thing. Whatever. It was another conversation. You can talk about that. But this teacher, hired a teacher. She was an incredible, brilliant, smart leader, all of it. And I used to do my thing as a principal, just, have my Sunday emails that I would send out. One day she sends me an email back, and it's the RSA Animate video with Sir Ken Robinson. Because I guess my email triggered that with her. When I watched this, Amir, it changed my life. I did a deep dive into Sir Ken Robinson, deep dive into Tony Wagner. Tony Wagner has this book, Creating Innovators. Have you read it? This shit is incredible. Like, there's just, again, the Blue Man Group. You know the Blue Man Group? They have a blue school downtown in Manhattan where they implement the Reggio Emilia approach to early childhood education. We could do this in public schools. I'm telling you, I ran one, had the budget. I just needed permission, but like, it's just anything's possible. And we need radical imagination in our public schools and in our politics. Radical imagination.
And as a founder of an online education platform, when you say get unplugged, I say, hell yeah. My kids go to an outdoor preschool, and when they do plug in, and when kids plug in, I think they need to be plugged in talking to each other and to humans, working on their interests with a far broader view of education. And the idea that just they're going to be able to talk to an AI kind of misses the point completely. I mean, I love Sal Khan. He's done more for online education than many, many people. And yet I think some of the discussion around AI and education is kind of so off base. And if you think that AI is going to take away people's tasks, then you have a very, very narrow view of what people's value and tasks are. You talked about the different sides of the brain. Anyway, okay, I'll get off my soapbox because we want to hear from you. But I wanted to ask, looking forward, what are you going to be focused on next? What's going to be most important to you, and what are you going to be most outspoken about moving forward?
Man, I don't know. My first instinctual response was, the revolution continues, man. The work continues. I mean, I love education. I learned a lot about the political system. I love people and I love community. And I plan to continue to be myself in those spaces, just now as sort of like an entrepreneur or private citizen or free spirit, whatever you want to call it. I hope to, continue to have my hands in all these spaces driving transformational outcomes, right? My doctoral work was on the concept of community schools. And community schools, again, similar to what I described with CASA, school working with community-based organizations to provide the wraparound services to children and families in a real holistic way, right? What are your mental health needs? Are we meeting those? What are your healthy foods? Are you getting enough healthy? Your dietary needs? What are your housing needs? What are your transportation needs? Workforce development, upskilling, academic needs, school with community working together to help our most vulnerable people. And I think one collaboration that needs to happen, a marriage that needs to happen, is between education and healthcare. And that's what my dissertation focused on, education and healthcare, but specifically behavioral health. One of the books that really influenced me in this way is the book How Children Succeed by Paul Tough. And he talks about, again, how children succeed. What's the answer, right? The ultimate answer. And the answer that he came up with was grit. That's how children succeed. That's how people succeed. It's pushing through, right? It's perseverance, which is true. But in this book, he referenced a study done many years ago, I think in the 80s, on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And in this study, he talked about, so what they learned from the study, what they saw was a lot of middle-aged people of a certain class developing chronic health ailments for reasons they didn't quite understand. And then when they started to interview these middle-aged people with these chronic health ailments about their childhood, they were blown away by the level of trauma these people dealt with during their childhood. And what was discovered was when you go through trauma before the age of 18, but particularly before the age of 3, like prenatal to age 3, the brain's prefrontal cortex doesn't develop properly, and thus you struggle with higher order thinking and critical thinking in school. Therefore, depending on your background, you're more likely to be placed in special ed. You are more likely to be on the school to prison pipeline. You are more likely to be incarcerated. And you probably saw similar studies that look at people who are incarcerated, and they study their level of trauma, and it's off the charts. And so when I learned about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, it gave me, I started looking at education differently. And so my dissertation work was around the impact of ACEs in community schools and what community schools are doing about it, to paraphrase. And so I think there's a real opportunity, and Amir, partner with me on this because it could be great. I've never been, and trust me, I've been to professional developments in education all over the country. I've never been to a professional development that included nurses, doctors, teachers, and teacher assistants talking about the communities that they serve together in a particular area.
Let's partner on this because, you know, the other thing on my mind is the humanitarian work we're doing with Palestinian refugee kids.
Yes.
And, yeah, this is an incredibly traumatized group. And we want to trauma inform our teachers, especially the ones working with it, but all of us. And I think the learnings from that can help start to give us some clues about how to address the mental health crisis in the US. So because this is a really big area, so I'd love to partner with you on.
Huge area, man. Healthcare and education. There's a marriage there that hasn't happened yet that I think can be transformative for kids and families and communities. And again, doing that kind of work on the ground in community, which is also education work, that's how you change society, right? Because the members of Congress are who they are. And many of them are with us, but trying to, you know, I don't know, what's a good example? Chip Roy or I don't know, a member of Congress to get on our side on particular issues is not going to happen. We have to be people focused.
Well, Congressman, it's been such a pleasure to have you on, and we're so thankful for joining us for this conversation. Hopefully it's the first of many, both on the air and off the air between all three of us. So thank you so much for everything that you've done for your community and for us as well.
Absolutely. Thank you too, brother. Thank you both for having me, man, and looking forward to working together. This is the beginning of something special, God willing.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for being so outspoken.
Of course, man. Peace and love. Have a good day.